Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And I'm very pleased here to have Rick Bowers and Nelle Moffett. Hi, Rick and Nelle. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin.
Rick, and Nelle are you have a private practice where you do workshop and do practice groups and work with individuals and couples focusing on communication and conflict resolution. So you've been in the conflict and leadership area, and you've also co-authored a book, which is really what we wanted to talk about in depth here, is Empathy and Conflict Intervention, the Key to Successful NVC Mediation. Is there more you'd like to say by way of introducing yourselves?
Well, I don't think so. I do want to clarify what we mean by NVC. If this
please.
Yeah, I mean, nonviolent communication is what it stands for, and that can be a generic term. And specifically, what we're referring to is the work done by Marshall Rosenberg. He's a clinical psychologist, recently passed away, but he developed a kind of a model of communication that is very connecting. And he started a nonprofit, has taught NVC worldwide, and as a mediator, mediated conflicts everywhere from warring tribes in Africa to warring families, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the NVC mediation. NVC is like a two-way kind of conversation, and I'm specifically using it when he was in a role as a mediator.
Oh, okay. And this is the book, Empathy and Conflict Intervention, which is really great because that's kind of what the work I've been doing is around empathy and how do we foster a culture of empathy, and mediation seems to be a core benefit of empathy, is how do you bring people together. So from your book here, it says that you're bringing together the theories of psychology, conflict resolution, and sociology to explore the effectiveness of empathy and mediation. How did you come about writing the book?
Well, it's the quick turnaround of a long process of writing a thesis. So it was my thesis, and then Nelle took the lead on transforming the thesis into a book. And I was particularly interested. I was exposed to NVC before I started the conflict resolution program at Antioch University in Ohio. And Marshall Rosenberg, while being a clinical psychologist, so PhD, academic training, he's not, I'm not sure if the word would be well known or talked about, so to speak, within academic circles. Certainly my professors recognized his name and smiled with the work that he was doing, smiled in a positive way. I don't mean smirking. But it simply wasn't taught. The work that he was doing wasn't taught in academic circles. So I got coming up with the idea for a thesis. I thought, well, providing an academic underpinning of some existing academic theories of why this stuff might work might take it more out of a realm of just a cute thing that he came up with, but that it really is something very solid. So that was the goal, and turns out a theoretical research methodology is somewhat time consuming. So it took probably a number of years to pull all of that together and get the thesis done.
And what were your backgrounds? You've been working in the mediation? Have you both been in the mediation field, or what?
Strangely enough, no. That was an growth. Well, I was a computer geek, computer scientist for a number of years, and had a chance to retire and think about what's next. And I love peace, hate conflict, had no tools for dealing with conflict. So I decided I'll go to graduate school and figure this stuff out. And as part of that, then started the mediation business and communications training. And Nelle can speak to her background.
Yeah, for me, communication has been a central focus and interest, and something that I wanted to develop more of. And I discovered nonviolent communication about 13 years ago and started in a practice group. What I realized when I read the book, and I'm an academic, studied psychology and many kinds of self-help sorts of modalities. So what I realized when I read Marshall's book is that this is not an intellectual enterprise here. I need to learn how to practice. Mm-hmm. Kind of like learning a new language. So if you want to learn French, you don't read a book about French, you've got to speak it. So I joined a practice group to learn how to change the way that I speak, how I use language, and how I interact with people. And so I'd had some background in that before Rick and I met, and introduced him to NVC as well. So it's something that is a part of our relationship. We're married, even though our names are different. And so it's something that we bring into the way that we relate to each other, and then of course the work that we do in the world together.
Well, you're mentioning about the theoretical work, I guess, in academia, and I've noticed that as well, that NVC is not in academia so much. I think there's more of it. So yeah, so it's great that you're doing that. So what I'm understanding is what the book is, from having read it, is that you're looking to create a theoretical model for how empathy and NVC work, and you're bringing together different existing theoretical models and putting them together. Is that kind of, am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And Rosenberg's work is kind of 4 building blocks. It's clear observations, feelings, needs, and requests. And he packages those together in different ways. And one of those ways is he refers to as NVC empathy. But to me, it's a kind of a training wheels for teaching people how to do empathy. And it's not just teaching, it's changing a consciousness. So empathy is a key part of NVC, and that's why it ended up being in the title of the book. It's not the only set of theories that the book covers: human needs theory, constructive developmentalism, many other things. But empathy, to me, is kind of the key.
Well, you know, I've done a lot of work on empathy, interviewed a lot of kind of experts in the field of empathy, and I wonder why empathy is not, and we talked about this, not more explicit in mediation. It seems to me that mediation at its core is about getting people who are in conflict to empathize with each other at the simplest core. If you can get people to start talking with each other, hearing each other, perhaps using like empathic listening or understanding each other's feelings and needs, that the conflict almost magically, if it's metaphorically like a knot, it just kind of unravels. And yeah, so it's why do you think empathy is not more central to not only mediation, but I would say restorative justice as well?
Yeah, I would like to see it more in both. I think there's a developmental aspect to it, and I didn't come up with this. The chairman of our department, Dr. Richard McGuigan, did his dissertation on it. And empathy is a long series of developmental processes, just as humans develop, going back to babies crying in a nursery. One baby starts crying and the others join in. That can be considered a rudimentary form of empathy. And what we kind of think is a normal capacity to provide empathy or to engage in an empathetic process is actually a fairly high developmental state. And what McGuigan proposed is it's over the heads of probably about half the population that's out there. So I think that's where NVC as a mediation model does such a good job, because it handholds people in empathy and helps them, do that process that they can't undertake in their own right. And the other thing is, even for those half the population, let's say in round numbers, that can really pull off full-blown empathy, normally conflict is a stressful situation, and we tend to regress when we're in the middle of the conflict. So again, that brings people back to a lower capacity for empathy. Now, I think that's the role of the mediator, to support the people in doing empathy. But I think that's a relatively new understanding, that people have trouble with it, not just have trouble with it. It's Robert Kagan, a psychologist from Harvard, wrote a book, and the title is In Over Our Heads. And it's developmental psychology, essentially. And he's saying that quite oftentimes we are in over the capacity of our minds, and simply don't realize it. We kind of look at each other as adults and all at the same developmental level, and it's simply not the case.
One of the reasons, what I'm been thinking about or have heard is the work of George Lakoff. I'm not sure if you know him. He's a linguist out of UC Berkeley, and he's saying that one of the problems is Enlightenment Reason. That that our culture is kind of based on this Enlightenment reasoning, which basically says that we're all individuals, we're all going for our self-interest, and that the mind is, we're kind of like separate beings, and that this is kind of like permeates the culture as a kind of like a set of premises of how we are as beings. And that all the premises of Enlightenment reasoning are actually scientifically been shown to be inaccurate, that we are not separate, that we are, through mirror neurons, for example, that we are connecting with each other all the time, that we're really integrated with others to, to varying degrees. And so he's making, I guess, an argument that it's the Enlightenment reasoning that is kind of like almost like a block to the empathy in a sense. And it really, empathy is this core progressive value he's saying, but I don't know how that resonates with your understanding.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it kind of is hand in hand with Marshall Rosenberg's, again, nonviolent communication, where he points to some other work that was done, but basically that at some point in world history, we chose a domination type of culture. And I think that also creates disconnect, where, everything from parent to child to boss to worker to student teacher, the other way around, that it creates disconnect. And he argues that our natural way of being is really connection, really that we're all one. And that's where his work was trying to break down those barriers and let our natural way of being really come together.
Yeah, he was pointing to our culture as being one of the domination. Then that brings on right, wrong, win, lose kinds of thinking. And I think very often in mediation, for example, it's coming from that mindset. Who's going to win, who's going to lose here? And so again, it's a developmental shift to a win-win kind of mindset and desire, that it's not just me getting what I need in this situation, but I win when you win also, and that we can contribute to each other and find solutions that meet both of our needs. And that's a real shift in mindset and culture, particularly within our judicial system, where a lot of mediation occurs. That's very much a win-lose domination kind of model. So I think that what Rick points out in the book is that NVC brings a real paradigm shift to mediation through the power of empathy.
Well, there's one. You'd had some really interesting people that you'd followed, had referenced in your book, and one was Dorothy Delanos, I think is how you pronounce it. I was really surprised when I saw that you referenced her, because I found her work, really a light bulb went off when I read some of her articles, and the main thing there was the difference between a transactional and a transformational empathy. So the notion is with transactional empathy, and she mentioned this in mediation, it's coming from that Enlightenment reasoning that I'm my own individual, going for my own self-interest, you're going for your own self-interest, and we need enough empathy to get what we can from each other, to understand each other, and then we go on our merry way, and that's still kind of coming from that self-interest point of view. Whereas the transformational empathy is that we value an empathic space between each other. Yeah. And how do we maintain that empathic space? And if there's a rupture in our connection, that we want to repair that empathic shared space where we really see the deeper feelings and needs of each other, and it kind of transforms through seeing our common humanity. And I wonder if you had any comments about that, because I see that as that even in NVC, sometimes it seems to me NVC comes from a transactional point of view, in that people say it's my needs, no, it's my needs, and it becomes a kind of a battle of needs where. I think it points towards the transformational empathy.
I think it does. Yeah. I think the beginning stages of a mediation might be transactional. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the NVC process that Marshall Rosenberg tried to get to, was that shift to a relational sort of empathy. And he used words like, he just enjoys the magic show. Once he gets that connection between the people where they can really see each other, and it's not just about my own needs, then he said, just magic happens. And it just reminds me, when I was first exposed to NVC, I was frustrated because he was talking about these mediations, and he spent a lot of time talking about creating that connection, but then he really never talked about what happened after that. Mm. And it took finally being in that world enough to realize that it's all about creating the connection, that you don't need anything beyond that, that Marshall's words are natural giving just starts occurring. People want to contribute to each other. So the actual, what's taught in formal mediation training is kind of more of a formal process of trying to figure out how we can compromise and do the best we can at meeting each other's needs. When that type of relational empathy starts occurring, where you really get each other, you want to contribute to each other, and any sort of mechanical process almost gets in the way. Mm-hmm. It's just fun to see, fun to experience.
And it's the mediator that makes the difference in which way it goes. So as Rick said earlier, it's the mediator that holds the skills, that holds the space for people that are in a conflict, may or may not have the ability to do that on their own. But the mediator holds that vision of the possibility of connecting on this level. And one of the things that on a worldwide basis and conflicts between countries, when mediators go in to mediate some conflict and they're working on a transactional basis, when the mediator's gone, the conflict erupts because there isn't that sense of connection. They haven't worked out the fundamental relationship issues between the countries. So for lasting peace in a marriage or between countries, it really takes a deeper level of wanting that connection, wanting that relationship, wanting the other person to thrive as well as myself. And that's what's possible, what mediation, what NVC mediation strives for.
Sometimes within, in terms of the definition of empathy within NVC, there seems to be a limited definition of empathy in terms that empathy is the guessing of someone's feelings and needs.
Yep.
And it seems to me that empathy is so much broader than that, that there's a whole mirror neuron aspect, there's a whole developmental aspect that you were talking about, that, you know, babies, when they hear other babies cry, they feel that emotional contagion or that empathic contagion, that they start crying. So, and then there's levels of empathy, you know, growing over time. So how about that? So I guess I see that as one kind of a problem in terms of that some of NVC, that it has a very limited definition of empathy. And I'm wondering what your kind of definition is.
Well, I agree. There is a broader definition. And I'm beginning to think that it sounds like I'm getting a kickback from Nonviolent Communication, the Center for Nonviolent Communication. And I'm not. I'm very passionate about it. But to me, the NVC empathy, of the very simplified guessing the other person's feelings and needs, is training wheels. And that's all NVC is. And it's once you learn to ride the bike, you get rid of the training wheels. And we don't have many ways to learn, this sort of connection, empathy and requests of other people without making them into demands. There's a whole breadth that NVC offers, but they're training wheels. And what Marshall is really striving for is changing consciousness. And with that comes the grander versions of empathy. Rosenberg was, I guess, a student and kind of a hands-on psychologist for the work of Carl Rogers, who was in the forefront of empathy and humanistic psychology. And when I read Carl Rogers, I mean, he's just got, it's interesting to read his work over the course of his lifetime. And his understanding of empathy, I think, shifted over his lifetime to be, much, much deeper, much, much broader, much more nuanced, much more, almost a spiritual dimension to it. And, I think Rosenberg picked that up. And what we see from NVC is just, again, the training wheels. But I think the depth of it is behind there.
Okay.
I mean, we've worked with people that, good people, but still had trouble living their lives of, going to a spiritual aspect of, love your neighbor is one of the, core principles of many religions. But boy, if you don't like your neighbor, how the heck do you love your neighbor? And NVC was just a life-changing thing for the individual that I'm thinking of. It allowed her to put her spiritual beliefs into practice. She actually, with that simple guessing of feeling and need, it just helped her to get into the space of the other person and start that empathetic journey. Just incredibly transformational.
Yeah, if you think of normal interactions in a conflict situation, what people usually are saying out of their mouths is story from their own perspective, not from the other person's perspective. So just their own side, accusations, blame, judgments, all this stuff. And when that's coming at you, particularly if it's directed at you, how do you access your own loving feelings when what's coming up is defensiveness? No, my story, that's not true. That's not what happened. I didn't mean it that way. You're reading this all wrong. All this, that's the source of a conflict. Those different perspectives, and where do you get the shift? How do you listen in a way that helps you to hear the hurt behind the story, behind the accusations? And that takes a lot of doing. There needs to be, values at that point can fall away. I may want connection, I may want love, but after a certain point, I've had enough, and I'm just in there fighting too. So it's this tit for tat back and forth. So we need to have some tools, but what does empathy look like in practice? You know, the ideals, the lofty consciousness is wonderful, but in practice, in this moment, how can I possibly access it? Oh, stop listening to story, stop listening to the accusations and what the other person thinks about me. Just listen for their feelings and needs. Ah, it's a lifesaver. You know, it's being thrown a life raft. That's all I have to do, and I can cut through all of that stuff. If we can grab onto that, we've got a chance. And the mediator, of course, has the advantage of being outside the conflict and can hear that more readily and can help the parties to hear that in each other. Sometimes it takes that neutral third party to break through the barriers of the emotionality of a conflict. So it, as Rick says, it gives a real how-to, what do I listen for to access this higher lofty concept of empathy.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that the NVC is more like a training wheels that and like a process that can move you from where you are in a practical sense towards building a more empathic way of being or a more empathic consciousness, and it gives you a set of tools and training wheels to move you towards that.
Exactly, yeah. And it's also, I like what Nelle said about a lifeline. We've noticed we don't fight a lot, but once in a while when we get stuck with something, that we will revert to very formulaic MVC way of communicating with each other. And it just helps us get through the muck. It's both a signal to the other side that, hey, I'm trying here. I'm doing the best that I can. But it's also just, it's kind of temporarily putting on the training wheel and gives me something to work with to get myself, back to a higher state of consciousness. Of actually wanting to connect with the other, or being able to connect with the other person.
Well, that's what something you've mentioned in the book about different levels of consciousness, and it sounds like this is, if you have this process, it's just a tool to help you move to that different level of awareness and consciousness then. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, one thing I was thinking, maybe we could go through a little bit of an overview of the book, like maybe by the chapters, like a little introduction through the different, kind of how you set up the book, and would that work? Sure. Like you start off with the introduction, then you had chapter 2 overview of NVC, and I guess yours part 1 was setting the stage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it was a wonderful rewrite from a thesis kind of standard building blocks, and probably went into a lit review, and I can't even remember off the top of my head with the title of the chapter.
Oh, yeah, the first one you had introduction, research areas of interest, the value of researching empathy, purpose statement, organizational tool, significance of the study for particular audiences, and definitions. That was like the first chapter.
Yeah. And then got into a kind of a high-level overview of justifying the need for the thesis for the research work that I was going to be doing, that basically nobody else had covered this. So there was a broad brush overview of the existing scholarship that was out there. And then talked a little bit about the methodology of what I was proposing. And the theoretical research methodology is somewhat unusual. As a matter of fact, I had to go through quite a few textbooks to try to find any mention of this approach. So traditional types of thesis have a quantitative type methodology. I looked around, I couldn't find data to support anything down that path that I could reasonably do in a number of years. Qualitative research, I looked at those areas, and they were interesting, ethnographic studies, go in and sit in a culture and write about it, phenomenological study of people who have been through an experience, perhaps, of an NVC mediation, and write about their experience. That was one of the potentials, but I settled on what turned out to be a bigger undertaking than I realized, but a theoretical methodology. And so that's where I went.
Yeah, well, you had like chapter 2, you do an overview of the NVC process.
Yes.
And then chapter 3, you've got a preliminary scan of the existing research. That's your literature review. Then you had chapter 4, which was the methodology, which you're talking now. You really go through and explain your whole process in quite depth. So you're kind of looking at explaining the methodologies that you used. And then chapter 5 was conditions for successful mediation.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. And yeah, I mean, I really didn't see it out there of what makes a successful mediation. And, happy people at the end, I suppose, is the outcome. But what does it take to really set that up? And as I was reading some of Carl Rogers' work, not related to mediation, but in terms of client-centered psychotherapy, he talked about the conditions for a successful intervention, let's say, in psychotherapy. And many of the building blocks that he talked about, I really resonated with, that they need to be there as part of a successful mediation as well. So I really built on the work that he had proposed in terms of therapy and move that over to mediation. And that, I think that's an interesting contribution in its own right of, you need to know what we need to have in place when you start picking tools to pull together for an intervention. Why are we pulling that tool into the intervention? And it's to meet the fundamental building blocks of what we think is required for successful mediation.
Yeah, so you really give an overview of that and a kind of a framework, like a way of thinking about it, and pull different tools together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that this is the real contribution of this book. It's the only one that I know of this kind. Most NVC books or even mediation books are talking about the practice of it. And in this case, with Rick's purpose to bridge the gap between NVC and the academic world, this needed to provide a very structured, reasoned, step-by-step approach to seeing how NVC, what NVC contributes from that standpoint. So it's not a practitioner's book so much as it is for those who are really wanting some validation that this is not just something that Marshall can do and it's jazzy, but it's something that has a reasoned, structured, theoretical basis for it that others can do as well. So I guess to put it in more personal terms, it was a way of justifying or supporting NVC in an instructional program about conflict resolution. The absence of NVC from that is to me just a huge gap. And so this was to validate it, to put it in line with many of the other methods that are taught, and to place it in a way that says what it is and what it isn't, so that it can be useful in an academic training program for mediators, conflict resolution professionals.
Okay, when you say, it's like, would you say that NVC is the training wheels in that sense, and that kind of what you're trying to do is ride the bike of empathy? I mean, metaphorically, would that
Sure.
work?
Yeah.
So what we're really trying to do is create maybe more of an empathic way of being or an empathic consciousness. And the NVC is like one process, and there's kind of going to be all kinds of processes that can kind of help create that awareness or that consciousness.
Yeah, and just to put it in perspective, one of my cohort came up to me after I was talking about empathy, and she said that she was from back east. I guess I won't guess the name of the state, but the mediation training for the state really pushed aside empathy. I mean, they did not want it at all. The mediator was supposed to be the stoic third party. You never smile at either party, you know, creating huge distance. And I think that's the value of bringing empathy from an academic standpoint, you know, back into mediation has a justification for it.
Well,
sides, you know, that's the concern with traditional mediation. So
would you say that it's like the traditional mediation is, oh, we need to be neutral, exactly. And the definition of neutral is to be detached.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that got to be hand in hand, detached with neutral, but you know, that's the state of affairs.
Yeah, when I do mediation, I don't say that I'm neutral. I say I don't believe in neutrality. I say I'm advocating for empathy. So it's like my position is I'm a person here. I'm not neutral. I'm biased towards empathy. I want to empathize with you and create empathy between you. And so that's kind of like my position. So I'm wondering how that resonates.
Well, I've said the same thing in mediation, so I'm really smiling inside and the outside too. And yeah, that goes against traditional mediation training. It really does. Yeah.
Oh, how do you feel that that's in terms of this empathic approach in mediation? How do you think where is it? What's, you know, how is it doing now in the larger mediation field now? Is it still, you know, a problem? Are people starting to do that more, or is it still a lot of resistance to that? Or wondering, kind of from your understanding or experience, where are we now in terms of the acceptance of empathy?
I think it still has a long way to go. I'm optimistic it'll get there. I can sound a little bit jaded here. I think the legal profession still has a strong handhold on mediations because, you know, typically when people are in conflict, they end up going to attorneys and eventually through the court system. And I think it's just going to it's going to be a long process before we retrain attorneys in other ways of dealing with people. So I think and I've been disconnected from that aspect for a couple of years now, but I suspect we've still got a long way to go.
And I think that there's a role also, not all clients are ready for that as well. So it's not like it's at this point in our social development, it's not like we need to shift entirely to NVC. Because not everybody's ready for that. Some people need to be told what their legal rights are, what their limitations are in terms of the law. This is what you need to do to resolve this issue. They want a directive approach, somebody that really gives them advice and says, here's the best that you can get. That's what they need. And they're not ready for a broader approach. So, you know, there's room for everything, all aspects of it, depending on what people are really wanting to create, including where you started being justice.
Yes.
And I think that being somewhat outside of the legal system and being a voluntary process brings in a lot more opportunity for healing and empathy and healing. So I have some hopes for that modality, and I hope that expands.
Well, my sense is that I've done some interviews about empathy within the legal realm, and there's a set of assumptions or premises that the legal system is based on. One being that we're all individuals, again, going for our own self-interest. That we're going to come to the truth through competition, that we have to have a judgment, you know, external judgment. We need retribution or punishment, and there's a whole set of premises that's built on, whereas empathy is very different, that we are connected, we are in relationship, that we want to, kind of work out, like through the restorative justice, you see that there's a dialogue, that we come from more of an internal agreement or internal, not kind of imposed, but that we come from ourselves, make kind of, I don't know, there's a word for that, I'm not thinking of it. But so there's whole different premises, and it seems that kind of moving the justice system from its premises over is going to be hard. There's whole big premises that this is based on, and that restorative justice is kind of in between. And even still, it has a lot of its roots in the justice, even verbally, calling it restorative justice. So I kind of like the term restorative empathy, actually, instead of restorative justice, that we want an empathic way of being to be fostered in general. And then when there's a break in the connection, we want to restore that empathic way of being. And so that's kind of how I kind of see the relationships and what's kind of happening there. I wonder how that lands.
Yeah, that definitely lands with me. And I think the problem is that, with those premises that you were talking about in the legal profession, even if we do set up at this point somewhat isolated mediators like you and perhaps us, where's the awareness? So when people hit conflict, they just turn to the legal profession, and there's not yet enough awareness out there of another path. So, I mean, even alternative dispute resolution is almost locked up by the legal profession at this point. And I don't mean to be overly critical of the legal profession. It's been a great contribution, I think, to the world in general. But I think at this point, we need something more, something different. And it's hard to get an awareness out there of that.
Well, that sounds like what your book is around, is trying to create that model. In part 2 of the book, you talk about the MetaModel. So you go into building a framework of this model, and then chapter 7 is you're bringing constructive developmentalism, and then chapter 8, human needs theory. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the model that you're building. And
yeah, I just wanted basically a picture of, here's NVC maybe in the center with the 4 principal building blocks of clear observations, feelings, needs, and requests. And I spent enough time on the thesis that I decided that just didn't have enough oomph to concentrate on clear, actionable requests. So that's kind of outside of the book. But so we got those 3 building blocks that are put together for various things in NVC, empathy being one of them, but also clear requests versus demands. So those 3 building blocks. And then I wanted a kind of pictorial that shows, okay, so here we bring in constructivism, which is a part of constructive developmentalism. What role does that have to play in those 3 building blocks? So an arrow that points to, okay, constructivism is a psychological theory, and it impacts, or it is the basis for the observation, the clear observations in nonviolent communication. So I went through that with the various building blocks or various psychological theories that I used in the model to kind of isolate where I think they fit within NVC.
Yeah, it's giving a rationale for each of the pieces of the model. So it's not random. It's not just something that Marshall Rosenberg made up that feels good, but you can tinker with it and you'll still get the same results kind of thing. There's basis for it that goes quite deep into who we are as human beings, and as these other psychological models point out. So by making the connection between the pieces of the NVC formula, so to speak, to human theories of human beings, then we're saying that this is an important piece and this is what it accomplishes, and that's why it's in this model and needs to be in the model. So there's really some visibility as you're using it as a mediator, for example, what you're accomplishing with each aspect of the formula.
Okay, so you have the model as a mediator, then you can kind of have a map in a sense. And I imagine it's also, by creating the model, it's also something that academics can work with and expand on too. So you've got both of those. You're bringing it into academia more so that academia can get their hands, you know, on it and start working on it, as well as a model for mediators.
Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, we've had contact from a few people who are going through doctoral dissertations that are interested in the book to use that so that they can go out and do the experimental kinds of studies of the theory and show that this is how it shows up with this group of people versus that group of people, and do that work. It takes the theoretical grounding to be able to do that kind of research. So we're really excited when people use this book as a basis for doing more research.
And that really was the goal, a huge goal. So that was very exciting when we started getting contacted.
Oh, great. Yeah, I started getting footnotes on other people's, on their research, on their doctoral thesis or their research papers. Yeah. So chapter 9 was empathy. So there you go into the empathy and the person-centered approach and of Carl Rogers, and you explore it, the empathy from different points of view there. See, I saw you had like Carl Rogers, and who is talking about the healing, I guess the therapeutic or healing properties of empathy, and then also into like Heinz Kohut, who is seeing empathy as more like a scientific tool for gathering research, but that he eventually seemed to come around kind of reluctantly to seeing the healing aspects of empathy, and that comes up a lot. I see even in the compassion community, they say, oh, empathy is just for finding out information, but compassion heals. And I think that that empathy itself is a healing agent.
Yeah, I think Carl Rogers would be applauding that statement. But yeah, and just in our experience of working with people, that it's just huge. It can't be overstated. I mean, was it Carl Rogers or Marshall Rosenberg statement was, it just feels damn good to receive empathy. And
I use that statement too. It was Carl Rogers. At the basic, when you boil it all down to it, feels damn good. So.
Yeah, I think another important contribution of this book is clarifying what empathy is, because as Rick was looking at the literature out there, it was just confused with sympathy and other things. So when people will use the word empathy, but meaning different things. And so in research, it's important to be very precise about the meanings of the words that you're using and what it is that you're actually researching. So for instance, if you're developing an instrument to measure empathy, you have to know what it is this construct is that you're trying to measure to be able to come up with an instrument. So I think that clarifying the terms and distinguishing them is a very important contribution of this book.
Yeah, so what was your what is your definition then? Because I've been working on the theme of empathy for at least 8 years, and I'm still confused about with all the definitions. I've talked to people like, I've interviewed a couple of times, Dan Batson, and he's written about, he did like really, I think you referenced him as well. Like he said, here's at least 8 ways that the word is used, and it's not even, there's still more. And his point is there's so many different definitions that the best you can do is when you start your discussion about empathy, be very clear about what your definition is and stick to it. And then you have people like Paul Bloom. I don't know if you've read his criticisms of empathy. So he wrote some articles. He's like writing a book against empathy.
Oh,
and
really?
he's written for the New Yorker. He's at Yale. Teaches at Yale, and so he's actually really criticizing like emotional contagion, right? It's like if you go to your therapist and you're all depressed, then your therapist gets depressed, by that. And he's saying that's really terrible, but I don't even consider that empathy. I just,
No.
and so what are your definitions? How are you defining empathy?
Well, I'm panicking a little bit over here. I don't think I could come up with one term. I mean, I resonated with what Daniel Batson said, that there are many, many definitions of it. I guess a very simple concept for me would be to just try to put my head in the other person's, shoes, maybe not their feet, not the best analogy or metaphor, but to try to see the world through the other person's eyes. And there's both a cognitive and an emotional aspect to that. So to me, that's empathy. And that's a very mature form of empathy, being able to do that and still hold myself who I am. Mm-hmm. There are lower levels of development where folks are simply not able to do that. Teenagers hit that age where in order to provide empathy to somebody else, they have to give up who they are. And that's not a good thing. So a mature form of empathy would be able to hold the other person's point of view, see the world through the other person's eyes, but at the same time have my perspective as well. So not get sucked into their world, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So have that self-other distinction.
Yeah, still present. Yeah.
One of the things in our practice groups when we're teaching empathy to others and trying to distinguish between sympathy and empathy is that with sympathy, like for instance, if you just had a relative, someone you cared about die, I would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and it's like I am focused on what I'm projecting or thinking that you're feeling. You might be feeling relief, because their suffering is over or something like that. But I'm projecting what I think you're feeling, and so I'm so sad. I'm so sorry. With empathy, it's you. Are you feeling sad? And it's a guess. I don't know how you're feeling, but I'm wanting to understand what your world is, and that gives you the opportunity to say, no, actually, I'm sad that they're gone from my life, but I'm really feeling relief that their suffering is ended. So it's getting what's alive in you is where we're targeting our empathy.
Mm-hmm. So the empathy is where is the other person, understanding where and what they're feeling and needing, and then actually kind of asking, is this how it is for you, and not like trying to just project it on them, but make it a question, and then also have that self-other distinction as well. Yeah, and then there's that emotional contagion of losing sense. There's a whole community of empaths. I don't know if you've heard the term empaths, or highly sensitive people. Yeah. And there's a lot of people who are afraid of empathy, it seems, because they kind of lose themselves, and that they don't know how to maintain that sense of self and others. And I've talked to people who, they grew up in an environment where they were never really heard, and they were kind of dominated, and that they don't have that self-other distinction.
Well, Robert Keegan from Harvard talks about a developmental state that, again, teenagers hit, and people may stay in that developmental level their entire lives. He calls it, he usually goes by numbers, but it's been called the affiliative state. And that's what it is. I give myself up when I, take on the suffering of the other person. I'm all consumed by that. Or I give up my own view of the world and completely take on the values and the way of seeing the world from the other side. So it's very much a developmental trait. And I think you're right. I'm not sure how to tie the highly sensitive people into that, because I think that maybe spans developmental levels as well. And I'm not sure where that fits in.
Well, I just lost my train of thought. For me, NVC was a way of actually strengthening that ability to be in myself and with others. Coming from a codependent relationship actually was what got me interested in learning NVC. So being able to provide empathy to myself, to access, well, what am I feeling and needing in this situation, and providing empathy to others in a way that is really honoring where they are. It helped me to create that distinction, so that I had a way of being with somebody that wasn't merging with them, giving up myself, or trying to take care of themselves because I couldn't handle their pain. So empathy in NVC and the tools in NVC actually helped me to develop in that area. And then the other thing I was going to say is that in conflict, when you've got people who are at that developmental level that cannot hear someone else's perspective without having to give up their own, that's where people start, fighting for their needs, the rebelliousness of teenagers, if you want to put it into a category. I can't hear what you're wanting from me without giving up what I'm needing in this moment. So there's no resolution in conflict if that's the situation. So again, the mediator can bring in the ability to hold both, and can help others to shift, even elevating their own develop their consciousness in that moment to a higher level than they could achieve on their own.
Oh, so what I'm hearing there is that in your own relationship, you had like a codependent relationship, so you weren't able to connect with your own feelings, and that with NVC or these tools that help you create a self-other distinction with each other, and you're seeing that maybe like teenagers or whatever might not have that self-other distinction, just get kind of wrapped up in the feeling, or they rebel because their feelings are suppressed, and that a mediator then is sort of like is holding that empathic way of being and kind of helping the different parties to maintain that sense of self and kind of nurture that empathic way of being with all the parties, and that they've got that resilience or whatever it is that they can then support others.
Yeah, they've got a little bit of distance from the conflict, and I think that allows them to, that neutral third party. There's a huge value to that if done effectively. Yeah, that's I've done mediation too, with like in my family, and the parties are yelling and screaming at each other and pointing at each other, and then just to really be there and be listening to both, reflect what each side is saying, so that they start feeling heard, and then have them start talking with each other and supporting and holding kind of that empathic, reflective, dialogue. And it's like amazing how effective that can be. Yeah, it is. And in my words, it's an honor to be in the middle of somebody's conflict like that. I mean, invited in and participate. And it's mind-blowing for me.
Well, where do you see your work going next?
Well, I think we're just going to continue on our practice of supporting people and learning NVC. To me, it is the most available tool for changing consciousness, maybe one person at a time, but changing world consciousness. So that's an important one for me. I'm also working on my next book, and have been for a number of years, but developmental aspect of spirituality. So again, developmentalism, but in a spiritual context.
Yeah, we were recently supporting a social service agency called Helping Hands Reentry in Seaside, Oregon. And this is an organization that supports people who are coming out of prison or who are in recovery from addictions. And they have a residential program. And so we were teaching NVC separately to the staff and then to the participants in the program. So working with people at very different developmental levels in that aspect. But it's very rewarding to work particularly with the participants and present to them a different way of being in the world and how they can get their needs met in other ways than bullying or manipulating or lying or whatever it may be. So giving them some tools to communicate effectively what they're needing. And in order to do that, they've got to go inside first and find out what they're needing. And this is a clientele that mostly just expresses their needs through erupting or acting out or violence towards, whether it's physical or verbal violence towards others. So it was really gratifying for us to see the shift in a relatively short period of time in their willingness to hear what we were saying. At first it was, can't use that in the hood. You know, it's not wanting to be vulnerable, not wanting to be visible in terms of needs. No, I don't have any needs. And so to see the shift as they began to practice with each other, different ways of communicating and expressing and seeing the power of it. So that's the kind of work that lights us up, is really seeing that transformation in individuals and empowering them in their lives to connect with others and feel more competent in being able to get their needs met positively.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you keep working on writing about empathy and getting the word out. It's really enjoyed the book, Empathy and Conflict Intervention, the Key to Successful NVC Mediation. And your website is speak-peace.com. Is that the best way to get a hold of you?
That would do it. Yep.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for that and for this wonderful discussion. And I hope we can keep in contact.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you, and I just, again, love the work that you're doing. And boy, spreading the banner of empathy is a wonderful mission.
Yes. Thank you, Edwin.